Thank you all for coming, and yeah, I'll do my best with the mic here. If it gets bumpy or if you have trouble hearing, raise your hand and I will try to make an adjustment. I know with these things you don't want them too close, you don't want them too far, then you can't hear it all. But so I'll do the best I can. So thank you, Chuck, for that introduction. Thank everybody for coming today. As Chuck said, this work kind of came out of my awareness of Onondaga Lake and what's going on there with the cleanup. I grew up in Westvale, not far from the lake, when the solvent process company was still in operation. You could see the gravel pile with the big, limestone, yeah, along Milton Ave. And so kind of growing up with it, when I was looking for a project for my PhD, one of the things that the questions that kept coming up over and over was, we want to know what the lake was like historically before it became polluted, to kind of give us some vision, a model for how we can clean it up. But you notice my talk is not called Onondaga Lake, it's Onondaga County. That's because this project has kind of grown, for me, into a question of what were the forests like, what were the wetlands, what were the waters like before the Erie Canal, for example. Actually, my dissertation stops. I stopped my research in 1825 because of the importance of the Erie Canal in terms of the development of the area. So we're going to go all the way back to the Ice Age, not for very long, but that's just to kind of remind ourselves that the history of the plant and animal communities did not start in 1600s when the first Europeans came, or even in 5000 or whatever. They really started at the end of glaciation. And then some more current plants. I'm not sure what number 3 is, but we'll find out. And then, sorry. Now, I'm also collecting information on animals, the historic fauna. Mainly, my focus is plants, just so I can finish. But I've done some work with animals, and we'll talk a little bit about that if we have time. Try to keep this reasonable length. So I've kind of divided this whole question of what is historical into 2 parts. One is sort of pre-historical, before we have records, written records, and then post-historical. As most of you probably know, it's kind of nice to be speaking to a group of historians, probably know more about the history of the area than I do, but from my understanding, Samuel Champlain was really the first person, the white man, to come down in our lake that we know of. And then, of course, there's a lot more written records after 1600. So I'm going to kind of start with the post-Ice Age plant communities. So, of course, this area was covered with ice not so long ago. By about 10,000 years ago, the glaciers were gone. And one of the interesting things that I've learned is that, so in the past 10,000 years, it hasn't been just any particular climate. It's been cold, it's been warm, it's been wet, it's been dry. It has been fairly consistent in terms of about the last 6,000 years, this area has been able to support deciduous forests. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's just some examples of the...
What do you mean by those numbers?
Oh, I'm sorry.
28,000?
The 28,000, I believe that is years before present, and I'm sorry to leave out the units. I don't think that's BC. So in a lot of these, what they call paleoecology, for the timing, they use this term BP, before present. And the number that they're using is 1950. So present started in 1950, and that's just because, I don't know, maybe somebody important was born then? No, I don't know. But I think that's when they started to use radiocarbon dating. And so this before present became more and more important. And yes, if there's any questions along the way, or if you can't hear, or if you don't understand something, please raise your hand and ask. That's a good question. So just to give us, it's kind of an old drawing, but the idea that the ice sheet melting north, and right along the ice front you have Glacier Lake Iroquois, and of course the drainage was blocked to the north along what is now the St. Lawrence River. It all went out the Mohawk River. And so a place like was underwater, no plant communities then. And you'll notice here, there's a couple of places where people have taken peat cores, and I don't know if you guys have heard about this. It's one way to reconstruct what plants were here. Is, you go down, 10 or 11 meters, get a core, and then it's quite tedious work, but you count the pollen grains, and so you can kind of get an idea of what force occurred at different times. And the way you get the time is the radiocarbon dating that I was talking about before. And so that's Sandy Ridge Bog, where there was a carbon study done, and Syracuse was underwater at the time. So as the ice melted north, and gradually the St. Lawrence River opened, so the water could flow north, and the land dried out a little bit. What was the landscape like? There were here talk a little bit about animals. What we call these Pleistocene megafauna, so these large mammals that have all become extinct, unfortunately, depending on your perspective. Things like the woolly mammoth and the mastodon. So there was a woolly mammoth tooth actually found in gravel near Salina. So, and then I think a bear that they think was, not a recent bear, but one of these Pleistocene fossils also found near Onondaga Lake. There's also been mastodons found in the area.
Catherine, how long ago was that mammoth found?
The mammoth, all of these, what they call Pleistocene megafauna, the mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed tiger, all of those mammals, not all, but the ones that did go extinct were gone by like 8,000, I think it's BC. It does, the BC thing does get confusing.
And you said they found one in Solid?
In gravel near Salina.
Oh,
Yep.
And how long ago was it,
This was in the 1800s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they found a mastodon, woolly mammoth tooth. Now, so there's some question, was that carried with gravel, when there was a lot of water flowing, when the glaciers were melting? We're not really sure, but there certainly could have been these animals in the area. And then it started to get tundra vegetation. That would be the first plants that came because they could tolerate the cold. And then the first forests were spruce fir, the boreal forests. So there's, actually he was an ESF student named Chandler Rao who did a pollen core from Onondaga Lake. And I really give Chandler a lot of credit. I don't know how he did this, but somehow he took this sediment core from Onondaga Lake. Obviously I understand the methods for taking such a core, but I don't know how he worked around the contaminants that would have been in that. I guess maybe he just lopped off the top 30 centimeters or whatever. But he found that there were 18 different kinds of trees, so what we call genera. In other words, they're not specific species, but they would be groups of trees like the maples or the oaks or the ash trees that have been here present for about 6,000 years. Which is really remarkable when you think about the fact that since European settlement, we've pretty much lost chestnut, we've lost elm. We're on the way to losing ash with emerald ash borer. I guess it just says something about the longevity of these trees and the major changes that have come since European settlement. When it says no cherry or cedar, it means he didn't find any cherry or cedar pollen. It doesn't mean those trees weren't there. But if you think about a cherry tree, it has those big flowers that are probably insect pollinated. So that kind of pollen might not land in a lake bottom, right? Because it's sticky pollen that's carried by insects. So that could be the reason we didn't find cherry. I don't know about the cedar. So in terms of human presence, and humans have been a part of this landscape for thousands of years, as you all probably know, more than I do actually. About 9,000 years ago, that's kind of the number that somebody gave me. I guess that's plus or minus a few years. As soon as, especially after Lake Iroquois was able to drain to the north, people came hunting, fishing, foraging, and then when you started to get, there's 4,000 BC, I'm sorry I'm mixing units a little bit here, but that's about the 6,000 BC. When you start getting deciduous forests, now you have your berry trees and your nut trees, much richer in terms of a food source. And so when you think about it, corn was not really a major part of the diet till about 1000 AD. And so what were these people eating in terms of the vegetation before corn, beans, and squash? I mean, they had corn, they had beans and squash, as you can see, but apparently they weren't as much of a part of the diet as they are now. So the starch source, people think, was like acorns and other nuts. And of course, wild plants were an important food source. I've selected a couple different kinds of different plant forms. There's different forms of what people would eat here. So on the lower left is a wetland plant. You would eat the root or the tuber. Anybody recognize that plant? Arrowhead? Yeah. So arrowhead, and then the next plant you probably know is butternut. And all the way to the right?
Purslane.
Yeah, and purslane is an interesting plant because if you look at a lot of the field guides for North America, they said purslane was brought over here from Europe. But they found archaeological records of purslane from 5,000 years ago, both in Kentucky and up in Canada, what's now Canada. So probably this plant was here. People ate it as a green.
Yes.
Purslane, you eat.
You eat the leaves, and I'm told that they're very high in, omega-3 fatty acids, like even more than fish oil. So for those of us who don't live near the coast, we can't eat like sardines every night. This is a great plant.
You still can eat it?
Yeah, yeah. So if it's a weed in your garden, you should welcome it and encourage it, I think. So.
It is a weed, it grows in your garden?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a ground cover?
Yeah, I mean, some people consider it a weed.
Yeah, I do.
Is that brown
But
stick?
you can pull it, like you can weed it, but then you can eat it.
Oh, but that brown stick isn't part of the purslane.
Yes, that's the stem, and then of course the green are the leaves. So just some
Like
examples.
a woody wood.
Oh, okay.
It's not very woody.
Well, you
You eat
get
the leaves.
No, it's succulent. And actually, there was a woman at the farmer's market last year who was selling it, who was actually growing it and selling it. So,
You boil it, right?
yeah, you could actually collect it from your garden and sell it. at the
You're
farmer's
familiar
market,
with
right?
Yeah, right.
I don't need it right
How do you spell it?
Yeah.
Oh, I think they do.
there.
Yeah, purslane.
L-A-N.
It's one of these plants you see all the time in sidewalk cracks. Now, I don't want to necessarily eat those because,
People walk on.
yeah, people walk on. That's right. Anyway, so I was really happy in terms of my work at Onondaga Lake to find this map, and I know the print is too small for you guys to read it, and I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to show you the whole map. And the great thing about this map is that it does have information about the different forest communities. Very often, as most of you probably know if you've worked with old maps, there's not, there's roads, there's houses, and then, it might show streams and wetlands and such, but there's not a lot of specific information about the plant types or communities. I'll read some of these.
So is that O kind of at the top, is that Onondaga Lake?
Yeah, and this, if you know Onondaga Lake, and if you know which way is north, it's not like an east-west body of water. This almost looks like Oneida Lake might be.
Northeast.
Yeah, but so this arrow is north, so you kind of have to tilt it in your head. But you can see in the hilly parts, so the higher elevation, you have oak, and then I guess that's not plant, but oak, beech, and chestnut. Of course, chestnut was much more common formerly. So that would have been at higher elevation, drier sites. You have your oaks, chestnuts.
Is that
Beach.
railroad going through there?
It's on the side.
Yeah, this would have been before the railroads, I think. So,
It's along the west side of
Yes.
oh, this probably would have been a road, right?
I was
'Cause-
that line that's got tack marks across it, tick marks across it. That goes
oh, like right here?
between the two bushes. Yeah, between the bushes.
Here?
Yes.
I think that's the,
No,
oh,
down. South.
here?
That one, yeah, what's that one?
Here?
No, keep coming down between the two
Here?
groups of trees. Yes, that.
That could be an old road.
That's essentially,
That could be like
Route 11.
Genesee, or West Genesee
that's
Street.
essentially Route 11, which was
I don't think
the
that's Route
original
11, I think
trail.
that's Genesee Street.
was
Yeah.
developed by the settlers.
Yeah, I think that's the valley where West Genesee Street is now.
Onondaga Creek.
Onondaga Creek, again, this is really confusing because north is that way, but Onondaga Creek would be here, and look at all the meanders. They call it Onondaga River. Of course, no Syracuse yet, but you have the village of Salina, which was the
That
first.
might be Harbor Brook.
Yeah, Harbor Brook would be here, and so Harbor Brook comes in now where Onondaga Creek, Harbor Brook came in then where Onondaga Creek comes in now. So a lot of these creeks have been moved around for convenience of various activities. But anyway, so so this says Salt Springs, Ash Swamp. This is 9 Mile Creek here, 9 Mile Point. Has anybody been out on the new trail around the lake? Yeah, so it kind of goes out to 9 Mile Point. This says Sedge, Samphire. We'll talk a little bit about Samphire, Maple, Basswood, Cedar Swamp along Harbor Brook. This is Black Ash, Tamarack, Cedar. So these were all swamps here. And one of the things I learned from this map is that you think of Onondaga Lake and you think of the salt industry and the salt marshes. And I sort of had it in my head that it was surrounded by these salt marshes. And in fact, that was probably an artifact of the salt industry before all the salt industry really took off. The lake was surrounded by these wooded swamps. And with the salt industry, they cut down all the trees because they needed the fuel. In fact, the area around the lake for, I think about a mile out from the lake, was reserved by the state specifically for fuel to boil the brine to create salt. So I really appreciate this map because it shows what the lake was like before the salt industry really took off. Any other questions on this map? So one of the best sources for information about the plant communities are the early botanists that were here, at least potential sources. Do any of these names sound familiar to anybody?
Bartram.
Yep, Bartram was an important naturalist. Has anyone read his book? He's got a little book from when he traveled up in this part of the country. Familiar with that book? So he was here in 1743. Frederick Persh was another prominent botanist who was here in 1807. Peter Kalm was here even earlier. And I just put the mountain laurel picture on the right side of the slide. So he was a student of Linnaeus, who's of course the guy who named all the plants. And if Linnaeus liked you, you got a really beautiful plant named after you, like the Kalmia latifloria on the right, latifolia. And if he didn't like you, some smelly, ratty creature that he gave you, he named after you. But Peter Kalm was a student, kind of his protege, came through Onondaga. Unfortunately, Peter Kalm's notes for this part of his journey have been lost. But he's just got some great notes from when he was in Philadelphia, Canada. That is mountain laurel. Yeah. Kalmia latifolia. It doesn't occur around here, I don't want to confuse you, but we're a little far north. But, yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, like I say, Linnaeus really liked Peter Kalm.
Do you know of any places in New York State where that does grow?
I think in the Catskills.
Oh.
I think if you go down to downstate New York.
Big rural Florida.
So John Goldie, his collection was unfortunately lost at sea and his botanical notes have been lost, but he does have a journal. You can get it on Google Books, and this is what he says about Salina. Salina really had a really bad reputation, as some of you may know, for disease, malaria probably. So he says, in case, for those of you who can't read this, I've never been in a more disagreeable, unhealthy place than this.
What is he referring to?
Oh, Salina, sorry, not Pompey, of course. But yeah, Salina, until they lowered the lake in 1822, and probably even a little ways, sometime after that, had a really bad reputation for disease especially. So what I'm going to do now is just talk about some of the plants that have been particularly important to the history of the area, And I'm going to start with the northern white cedar. This is one of my favorite trees. It's planted a lot as a landscape tree, as most of you know. But if you remember from that map, there were several cedar swamps here. You see the Great Cedar Swamp, that's where Carousel Mall is presently. And that went all the way out Erie Boulevard. And I'm told that up until, I don't know, like 50 years ago, there were little pockets of that swamp still remaining where you could find some of the plants that were there historically. There's more cedar swamp, and cedar swamp down here. So, what is neat about cedar swamps, has anyone been to Nelson Swamp in Casanova? Yeah, they're incredibly rich botanically. So I think Nelson Swamp is something like 500 different kinds of plants, not counting mosses. That's what they look like. They're kind of a nightmare to try to like walk through because there's so many fallen trees, and they have what we call this hummock and hollow topography. But they're beautiful, like I say, rich in flora. So they used to be frequent here, but the larger trees have vanished, probably cut down for either fuel wood or roofing. They were used for shingles, of course. And just to show you a couple pictures of the orchids that would have been in that Lodi swamp, or the Great Cedar swamps. Things like this tuberous pink, and the yellow lady slipper on the left, and I believe that is dragon's mouth. We've got some labels here. Yep, lady slipper, the dragon's mouth on the right, calypso orchid, which I think at this point is extinct in the state, unfortunately. But there are records for all these beautiful orchids from that cedar swamp where Carousel Mall is now. So the next plant I want to talk about is a plant with a lot of historical significance, the eastern white pine. Of course, this was the tree of peace for the Haudenosaunee when they buried their weapons under a tree along Onondaga Lake, was the white pine. The 5 needles symbolizing the 5 nations that came together along the shores of Onondaga Lake. And so James Geddes, major engineer for the Erie Canal, one of the leader engineer, but he was also involved in politics. I think he was like a state legislator to the state here. I'm not sure if he ever went to Congress, but anyway. He got tired. He originally settled along Onondaga Lake and started a little bit of salt making business, but he got tired of the mosquitoes and such, living in the swamp. So he moved out to Fairmount. As a surveyor, he knew where the best land was. And if you know where Fairmount Corners is, where there's a little miniature golf course, that's where he built his farm. And unfortunately, there's really tragic destruction of one of the last outliers of the Geddes farm that was just knocked down for development, which is really sad. But anyway, he went out there and he said that area, which is now Fairmount Fair, was this white pine forest. Very valuable timber, and so he created a little sawmill along Geddes Brook there. If you think of where that golf course is, I don't know if you guys know, there's that steep drop, and I imagine he probably had his mill pond right above that drop, and it was that drop that allowed him to power the mill, the wheel to turn the mill. So some of the early names for Syracuse refer to pine, so these would be Haudenosaunee names, and honestly, I don't know enough about these native languages to know how accurate this is, but it's something I found in Beecham. Some of you probably know Beecham's work. So these are 2 early names for the area of the swamp that was later to become the city of Syracuse, referring to the white pine. And if you think of white pines, I believe this is from Nelson Swamp, actually. If you look in the lower part, you have the white cedars here, and then this is probably red maple or another deciduous trees. And these pines tower above the deciduous trees, and probably, they grew much taller formerly. provided habitat for things like hawks and eagles who like to have a vantage point. And so in some ways, I like to think now, we don't have those tall pines anymore, so these birds are nesting in cell phone towers. So they've kind of ecologically taken the place of the pine. So a little bit more about the white pine. There's a record for a pine on Genesee Street downtown. So in that area that was the Syracuse swamp, that had a circumference of 12 feet. And I don't know the diameter of this white pine in Fairmount, but it was supposedly, well, they measured it 230 feet tall. And unfortunately, it was converted to saw logs, as people did back then. And so this is unfortunate. I believe this is Beecham again. And so we think, okay, where did these forests go? Well, they're gone. So the next slide I kind of threw in thinking, you might know this information already, but this is New York State Census from 1825, and of course it'll tell you the number of males, the number of females, the number of cows and pigs and such. But my interest in this has to do with, if you're thinking of the forest, if you go all the way to the right, can't see it, but this is, okay, the number of sawmills per town.
Wow.
This is the number of asheries, so that would give you some idea of what potash production was like. And so that's something I'm trying to learn more about. And that's a question I have. If anybody here knows anything about potash production anywhere in Onondaga County, I'd be interested in more details about that. But, so for example, Pompey, so this is by town, or I guess they call them wards. If you go all the way to the right, there were 5 asheries producing potash. So that just gives you an idea of the amount of forest clearing that's going on.
10 sawmills.
Yeah, 10 sawmills. Now, and I don't know what it is about Pompey, but there's also 10 distilleries, so I'm not sure. Not sure what that means. I don't know what that indicates, but. And then there's a number of I don't even know what a trip hammer is. You guys probably do. Does anyone know what a trip hammer is? Anyway, you can find out the number of trip hammers. But this is the kind of data that, like, you don't think of census data telling you much about the forest, but kind of indirectly, it does. I just thought that was fun. Kind of back down Onondaga Lake here, the road to Salina leads to a swamp, a marsh. So I want to talk a little bit about this very important plant, samphire glasswort. Unfortunately, it no longer exists at Onondaga Lake. So this is a picture from probably the seacoast somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where. And people used to collect this from around the salt marshes. They used to pickle it. Children used to gather it and sell it door to door and make a little money.
Both of them, or is one?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's all the same plant. So it's this, I don't know, has anyone been, if you've been to the ocean, you can find this plant in like salt marshes, kind of along the edge. It's in the saltiest, briniest part of the marsh. It's an amazingly salt tolerant plant.
So
And there used to be a lot of it along Onondaga Lake.
it's all one word then? I mean, it's all means the same thing?
Yes, so these are 2 names for the same plant. Samphire, glasswort, the scientific name is Salicornia, you might see that. And this was, according to Beecham, kind of the signature species of the Onondaga salt marshes. Unfortunately, I don't know if it has medicinal qualities. I think the Onondagas used to collect it, and I don't know if they would know medicinal qualities. I just know people used to use it as like a salad green. And it had that like salty flavor. Like they said, the best time to collect it is in the spring after it's sort of been bathed in salt water. Kind of like a brine, like almost like pig meat, I guess. It makes me hungry.
The samphire used to grow in the salt pool that is on the side of Onondaga Lake Parkway. And that was where all the people from the north side would come out and collect it. And it was my thought, I realize that's 1970, is that in 78?
Yeah, that's 78.
I thought that one of your colleagues had found it again within the last 5 years.
Yeah, I don't, so John Leopold, who's my co-major professor along with Robin Kimmer, and Tony Leonardo are doing a lot of work with salt marsh restoration. I don't think they found any of this. One of the issues with this plan is it's an annual, so if it was mowed by the county, who, trying to keep the Onondaga Lake Park looking really nice and neat, then, it doesn't set seed, it's kind of like gone. I'll ask Don, but I don't think this plant has been found, and I don't know that they're trying to establish it, which is sort of surprising.
I thought Honeywell had planted some in their 9 Mile Creek restoration.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you may be right, because I'm not entirely up on what they're planting. I know they're trying to definitely restore a lot of the salt marsh plants.
But they did plant some salt-loving, 4 or 5 salt-loving as sandflowers.
Yeah, they planted, like the cordgrass, and I'm trying to think of some of the salt marsh plants that they planted. There's a bunch of them there. A lot of them are grasses and sedges. They're not like really bright, showy plants. Actually, there's a hibiscus. The native hibiscus is salt tolerant and used to occur all around Onondaga Lake. And that's got really a beautiful large flower. And I just think they're trying to plant that flower. So, anyway, but we can, actually, I can take your contact information and ask Don about the.
I think I talked to somebody two years ago,
Uh-huh.
and that's why, anyway, keep on going.
Okay. Right. So, the next plant I want to talk about here that was quite abundant was wild rice. So this was abundant around Onondaga Lake, the Seneca River, Lake Ontario. If you look at some of the old floras, like Payne's of 1865. So this, probably can't read that, but this was written in 1865 by John Payne, who was a state botanist. He wrote a flora of, I think he called it Oneida Basin, but it includes Onondaga Lake, Lake Ontario. And so he says, wild rice occurred, borders of Oneida Lake, abundant around Onondaga Lake, Oswego River, common in all the bays, inlets, marshes on the shore of Lake Ontario, all the way up to Oswego, Sodus Bay. So there was a lot of wild rice in the area. And so my question is, well, was this used by the Haudenosaunee? I don't hear them talk much about wild rice the way you hear the Indians in Minnesota talking about wild rice. And the sense I get is, at one point, it might have been used, say, before corn really came into use. Archaeologists have found traces of wild rice on pots, cooking pots. So apparently they think it was used, but probably a long time ago. I imagine it was used even after corn was used, but not as much as, people seem to prefer corn to the wild rice. Yeah, I think it's just, and that's just, so I went down to the Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia, and that's wild rice that was collected by Frederick Persh, one of the botanists I mentioned, in the Seneca River, I believe, and he said it was very common. So boneset is definitely a medicinal plant. It's in the sunflower family. There's a lot of it right there. And so here's the Seneca River, and this is a quotation from DeWitt Clinton. If you know his journal, Canal Journal, when he came through Syracuse, when he came down the Seneca River, he was going to go to Salina and kind of check that out. He and several other state legislators were kind of looking for, kind of scouting a trail for the Erie Canal. When he got to the outlet of Onondaga Lake, he said, it looks like the Valley of the Shadow of Death. That's Salina having that reputation for illness. this unhealthy, wetland, fever-generating country, but boneset is the cure for malaria. And not only Clinton mentions this, there's other botanists who say, you know, I got this terrible fever, ague they called it, probably malaria, and boneset is what they use. Now, I'm not sure how effective this is, but they seem to survive. So I have to say something about black ash. And if you know that ash trees, they have these compound leaves, and black ash has the leaflets right along the little stem there. It was, and it still is, important as a basket making material. That happens to be an eel trap, and we could talk about eels, but we're not going to because we don't have time. But that was a really important animal, of course. So the eel would go in, and then there's a little, almost like spines, barbs, and they can't get out. And the important thing to know about this table is that black ash was apparently once much more common than it is now. Right now, if you go to a swamp, you know, there's black ash here, black ash there. It's not really a common tree, but formerly it used to be a dominant species in wetlands around here. So what you're seeing, I can tell you what these numbers are. They come from the military tract surveys, you know, when they made those nice squares. Well, at every corner, of course, you have a tree, a witness tree, right? And so some people from Cornell actually went through, collected all that data on the different kind of trees and quantified it. So we have an idea of the kind of trees that lived here just based on the survey data
The ones that
from
have
that
to be growing
study.
at a corner, right?
Exactly. And some of the surveyors made notes on the trees kind of along the way. You know, those are the ones who are like, oh, well, thank you for doing that. Unfortunately, a lot of this data has been lost, but for this, I think this is for the military. I think this is for the boundaries that are within swamps. And so out of 660 that are current swamps, 47%, almost half, have black ash. So that's way more than any of the other trees. Yeah. So you can just see black ash swamps here. And very important basket making plant. Groundnut is interesting. This is in the pea family. It's a little tuber that can be eaten. So this is the root of the plant, and then, or the rhizome, underground stem, and then these are little swellings, almost like potato. They're edible. They're very high in protein, at least compared to a potato. I think I read somewhere this plant is like number 7 on this list of thousands of species that could potentially provide food provide crops, for example. There's groundnut. There's also a groundnut clan. So this was a very important plant to the Haudenosaunee. They would harvest it. They would even collect those little tubers and kind of stick them in where they wanted more groundnuts to grow, and they usually oblige. And in the old days, people would plant this in their garden because they thought the vine was very pretty, and I don't know to what extent people ate the root or the tuber. I'm actually trying to grow these now, so I'll let you know how that goes. So most of you are probably familiar with the fact that there were Jesuits here in the 1650s, and they had some comments on the plants that they found here. Of course, they didn't have names for any of these things because Linnaeus hadn't even been born yet, for one thing. So I don't know if you want to try to guess what this plant might be.
What's the country of the cats?
That's a good question. So if we think of cats in 1650, probably they're either talking about bobcats or mountain lions. So the country of the cats was considered like Western New York, where there are more mountain lions. The country of the cats was where the Eries lived. So if you think of a plant that the range was a little further west and south, it happens to be we think, I mean, we don't know for sure. We think that the Onondagas were growing pawpaw that they got from western New York. And I don't have a range map for pawpaw, but if you go home and look at the range, you'll see that the range is further south and further west. And so it's not really native to central New York, I mean, depending on your definition of native. You know, back then, just like today, people, they found a good plant, and they, a plant with a desirable fruit, a desirable characteristics, and they brought it home, planted it here. And Frederick Persh, the botanist who I mentioned, did find pawpaw growing at Three Rivers, so it did hang on a little bit. May still be some up there. Haven't looked yet. And I think this is my last plant. If you look in historical literature, this is just called root. And you read about the Onondagas going to like trading posts and selling root and making a lot of money. Especially once the fur trade kind of died down. Of course, this valuable root was ginseng. And my understanding is that kind of the Pompey, Fabius area that really was well known for ginseng, right? Like Labrador Hollow area. Got American ginseng. There was quite a brisk ginseng trade in central New York. So ginseng was discovered in Canada, I'm going to say the early 1700s by the French. And they kind of, quickly depleted the supply. And someone found, maybe it was Bartram, found it in central New York. And this is, the guy on the left is William Johnson, who was the Indian, what do you call it? Yeah, for the British, liaison for the British. But he also tried to make a little money on the side, and so he was very, very big into the ginseng trade. So he would trade rum for ginseng, and this all occurred at the mouth of Onondaga Creek, near Onondaga Lake. It does, doesn't it? So that's sort of part of the Onondaga Lake story, because the trading would occur right where at the mouth of Onondaga Creek. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. I said, probably stick to plants, but I also have a whole chapter on the passenger pigeon, and that's like a whole other story. But I thought I would at least mention it since 2014 was the 100th anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon. I kind of went through newspapers and old bird books from Onondaga County, and you get a sense that passenger pigeons were fairly common here. I mean, they're very nomadic, so that they would come and go quickly. In other words, they wouldn't come and stay the whole summer. But there were nest sites. I think there's one in Pompey, actually, in 1876. I can't remember all the details. But one of the neat things, part of the story related to Onondaga Lake, is that they were very attracted to salt. And so they would come by the thousands to the salt springs. And the Onondagas would trap them by the hundreds. And they wouldn't have people to eat all those passenger pigeons, but they would process them, dry them, and then save them for the winter.
They were caught to eat.
Pardon?
They were caught.
Yes, yep. They were kind of part of this whole subsistence economy. So of course the protein sources would have been fish, but also passenger pigeons, deer, major one. And there's Martha, the last passenger pigeon. So I'm going to stop there. So we had talked a little bit about changes in the Onondaga flora over time. There have been many changes due to climate, also to human influence. Like I said, people have played a key role, and the change continues. I mentioned emerald ash borer coming. With climate change, sugar maple may move north. We have oak hickory forest here. We don't know. But anyway, change continues. And so just some acknowledgments. Don't have a picture of Robin up there. Don't tell her. But there's Don. And Don and Robin, my major professor. John Anderson, I spelled his name wrong. One of the neat things about this project is you get to meet a lot of people who are kind of interested in the same work, and people have really helped me, been very generous with sharing information. Mullen knows a lot about the plans, and then the last four people are groups that have provided funding for this work. So that's all I have. There's time for questions.
Catherine, what would be the, and maybe I read this and I totally forgot, either the draw for the bald eagles coming back down Dog Lake, it has nothing to do with any of the flora or fauna or...
Well, it does, in a way it has to do with the fauna. Since Onondaga Lake is becoming cleaner, a lot more fish in the lake, a lot of fish breeding in the lake, and plus there's just a lot more eagles. I think it was up to, I'm going to say up to the 1970s, there really weren't any bald eagles in the state. When they started this transplant program, they brought eagles from Alaska. I think there may be a few in the Adirondacks. So the populations of the eagles have really gone up, and the lake's cleaner, so there's more fish. And the fact that there's open water because of the sewage treatment plant, they're there for the fish, as far as I know.
I've noticed in the past several years that the turkey vultures have been coming in, just in the past 10 years,
Huh.
and ravens in probably the past 4 years. I've never heard it before, just crows, and now the ravens are around. So it seems like more
Yeah.
types are coming in.
Yeah, there's definitely more ravens. It's, one great way to look at those changes in birds is to look at the breeding bird atlas from the 1980s versus, I think there was an 85 they did it, and then 2005, something like that. And there were very few ravens in the area in the state, actually very few, but they're up in the Adirondacks mostly, and now much more common. So, and I'm not sure what's driving that. More food, I guess.
We have had eagles up in the old fly here. People are aware of where the old fly is there.
Mm-hmm.
2 years ago, I saw one, and last year I sighted one that flew around our farm and back
Oh.
up that way.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're becoming much more common, which is a good thing.